poultry specialist, a poultry consultant with close to a decade of experience in the field, and this is what I do.
So we are going to be discussing today with Dr. Lukman on what brooding is, what it entails, how you go about it, and its importance also. Why do you need to brood? That's one of the questions we'll be attempting to answer today. Why it is important to brood, and what are some of the things you need to put in place if you must have an effective brooding system. Okay, so let's go on to, first of all, understand what brooding entails.
Brooding is a process whereby you basically just give care. You give care to a young animal to support life. That's basically what brooding is. And contrary to many people's opinion about what brooding is, brooding in poultry takes just the first 4 weeks of life. It doesn't extend to the last point where you're giving your last vaccine, which is going to be at the 15th week. So brooding is basically happens within the first 4 weeks of life. And what that entails is caregiving, intensive caregiving to those young animals that cannot fend for themselves, so that process will support life and be able to help them to grow or to develop to a point where they can actually fend and take care of themselves as time goes on. Now, the cardinal point of brooding means you just have to give care, and that covers so many aspects. I hope I'll be able to answer a lot of our questions and give more explanations to our viewers as it goes.
Okay, so if I get you correctly, brooding basically entails the first 4 weeks.
As it regards to poultry.
Okay, first 4 weeks. That's where you give intensive care to the birds. Yes. So after those first 4 weeks, does it end there, or you still continue with the caregiving even after the first 4 weeks?
Okay. Now, as far as poultry goes, when you talk about layer birds, that's the pullets that you get to keep on your farm to lay. There are 4 stages to it. There's the brooding stage, there's the post-brooding stage, there's the grower stage, and then there's the laying stage. In some instances, you even have them split into 5. The brooding, post-brooding, grower, pre-layer, and then laying stage. Those are the stages that involves as far as pullets on poultry is concerned.
Okay.
As far as those stages are concerned, I'm going to explain. Now, these stages are being separated into these 5 categories based on the operations and activities that will be happening within this period. Now, it has to do with your operation in terms of caregiving, the type of feeding you are giving your birds, and the developmental stage and what is expected as an output from your birds. Now, I'll start with the brooding stage. The brooding stage is a very, very crucial and very, very important aspect of your poultry when you're talking about pullets, poultry in general. Once you get the brooding stage wrong, a lot of things will likely go wrong and you might not get the desired output from your bird. And this brooding stage is just the first 4 weeks of life, which is where you give them everything they need. You have to provide that intensive care, what some people term as TLC, tender loving care. That's where you need to provide that TLC at the first 4 weeks of their life, which is very, very important to every development. And one of those aspects is we're talking about heating. Now, you realize that when you have day-old chicks coming on your farm, you realize that they have feathers which is more like hair, very, very soft and fluffy. Now, you know, as far as temperature changes comes, they will not likely be able to adapt favorably to those temperature changes, which is why you need to provide a conducive environment as regards to temperature for your birds in that first 4 weeks of life. After that first 4 weeks, you realize that those feathers begin to change to a more thicker feathers that can help them support whatever changes they're getting in temperature. So the first 4 weeks, apart from the temperature, you need to heat them up, meaning you have to provide an external source of heat. Unlike when you have local birds growing, when you have the mother with them, the mother hen tends to cover them up, provide heat for them. Now in this case, when you're bringing them on the farm, the mother hen is not there. So you have to provide that heat externally. And there are so many means by which you can provide that heat. You can use charcoal pots, you can use gas brooders, you can use thermal lamps. A lot of methods you can use, but the basic thing is to provide that heating that they will need for the first 4 weeks to support life. As well as the feeding, also the type of feed they will be consuming, you need to give them the feed that will support their developmental stage within that first 4 weeks, which basically is the chick mash and can come in different presentation, either in mash form or in a crumbled form. Now, basically, poultry feed comes in three different forms, three different presentations. You have the pelletized, you have the crumbled, and you have the mash. With the pelletized being the most coarse form, it has a bigger particle size, while the crumble has a less coarse particle size compared to pelletized, and then the mash is almost powdery, which is also of less coarse particle size compared to the crumble. So when you grade them, you have the mash having the lowest particle size, followed by the crumble, followed by the pelletized. But now when you look at the size of the pelletized, you realize that your birds at day old will not be able to pick the pelletized because of the particle size and the size of their beak. So what you need to start with, you can either start with either the mash or the crumble for your chicks during the brooding, which is the first 4 weeks of their life.
The feeding program, I know it's as they develop and grow, it tends to change. So at what points do you change the feed and how do you go about it?
Okay. Now, when you talk about living things, be it plants or be it animal, what the basic characteristics are we meant to know while in maybe primary, secondary school, we have an acronym for it called Mr. Niger D. Okay? And the end part of that Niger is what is called nutrition. Now, for any organism, be it plant or animal, for it to grow, there has to be nutrition. And in this regards, feeding is the basic thing. Now, what you give as feeding will vary depending on the age and the developmental stage and what is expected as yield from that particular animal. So like I said, the whole poultry process as regards to pullets or layers as we call it is divided into 5. You have the brooding, you have the post-brooding, you have the grower, you have the pre-layer, and then you have the layer stage. Now for the brooding stage, which is the first 4 weeks, which is the very, very important aspect of their life, that's when you talk about feeding like the chick formulation, which I talked about. Either you use the chick mash or you use the chick crumble. Now you realize that that particular feed has a high protein content. Of course, that first 4 weeks of life, that's when most of the development comes, and most of the nutrients they will need for development has to do with protein. So at that period, protein is very, very important and crucial. So at the first 4 weeks of life, you give your chick formulation, which can either be mash or crumbled. Now the next stage, which is the post-brooding stage. Now the post-brooding stage starts from week 5 up to week 8. The brooding stage is from day old to week 4, while the post-brooding is from week 5 up to week 8. Now, within that day old to week 8, you use the same type of feed, but what differentiates is the activities or the operations that actually ensures with the animals, with the birds in this regards now. The first 4 weeks, you need to heat them up, provide everything they need and all of that. After that first 4 weeks, you realize that they would have grown thicker feathers that can help them manage with temperature changes. So after that first 4 weeks, the heating aspect of it is out of the brooding. So you don't need that heating aspect of it. That's where the brooding. The brooding basically is the heating aspect. That's the layman understanding. When you are brooding, you have to provide heat, which is for the first 4 weeks. And after that first 4 weeks, you realize that they begin to grow thicker feathers that can support them to manage temperature changes. And that's when we go into the post-brooding, which is the next 4 weeks. So between day old and week 8, you use the same type of feed, which is the chick. It can either be in form of mash or crumble. Now from week 9, your birds are growing now. Now from that week 9, what you want from your bird is you want the birds to go bigger with thicker feathers and then go taller as well. Now in that regards, bones will be developing. Okay, as their bones are developing, it means they will need more of the supplement of what will help them growing those bones, which is more of calcium. And then there has to be a balance between the calcium and the phosphorus. So that's one of the nutrients that is more in the grower feed. You have more of calcium in it compared to what you have from the chick.
So it facilitates the growth process.
Yes, growth process, especially as regards to the bone as they are growing.
Bone development.
Yes, as they are growing, their weight increases and they need the bones to support the weight as they are growing. So while they are growing, you need something that will supplement to help them improve the strength of their bones.
I know the weight is a very crucial,
very important
component. They have to grow weight to be able to produce on time.
So the grower stage starts from week 9 up to around week 15, which is the post-brooding stage, which is the grower stage rather. So at that period, they take the grower feed, which can come either in form of the mash, the crumble, or pelletized. Now, why pelletized is coming here is because at that stage, these birds are grown bigger, their beaks are bigger, they can pick the particle size of the pelletized. So you can use either of the three. Now, anything from week from week 16 up to week 18, where you are expecting them to start developing features that will support egg laying. That is the pre-layer stage. Okay. Yeah. So at that period, the feed formulation also changes. You can decide to go for pre-lay at that period, which is a ration that is in between the layer and then the grower. Okay. Yeah. So by the time they start laying, you know, of course, they've exceeded that pre-lay stage. Now they've gotten to laying stage. They've started dropping eggs. Now, as a rule of thumb, you monitor your birds, you watch out their production, so that you don't give them a feed that will be in excess of what they need, so that you don't begin to come down with issues like excess weight or excessive fat deposit when they've not actually gotten to the weight.
Okay. So it's possible to have your birds underweight, yes, and it's possible they can also amass fat
overweight
to a level where it becomes overweight.
So you just want to be in between the two, not underweight, not overweight, just at the right weight.
Okay.
What you want at that particular
So in monitoring that, I believe one could have a system to do that. So you monitor the weight of your birds. And yes. So how often should a farmer do that? How often should one check on the weight of the birds to determine?
Now, monitoring and examining the weight of your birds is something you need to do on a weekly basis. Okay. Because even on a weekly basis, the volume of feed they will consume will also change. As they grow, they want to eat more. And by implication, they are growing, so they should be adding weight. And then there are benchmarks of what weight is recommended or what is expected for a bird at every interval of their growth. Of course, you wouldn't expect that a bird that is 3 weeks old to have the same weight with a bird that is 6 weeks old. You understand? So as they grow, as they advance, the weight changes, and then you need to monitor that with your feeding volume, your feeding quantity as well. So every week, as their feeding increases, there's a chart for that too. As their feeding increases, also their weight also increases. But you need to monitor this and put it in check, so you know where you are lacking. If your birds are underweight at particular age, then you check their feeding. If it's something you need to improve on or reduce, then you check all those things and do the checks and balances.
Okay.
So on a weekly basis, you need to assess the weights as well as their feed consumption.
So now let's talk about biosecurity. Because I know it is very important that the birds are kept in a safe place, avoiding every form of attacks, be it biological or of any sort. And in terms of the people that also take care of these ones, I know it's also restricted. Okay, so what are some of the major biosecurity measures that a farmer must not joke with when it comes to brooding?
Okay. Well, like I explained earlier, when you talk about poultry, especially pullets, you are having an intensive care, intensive system.
Yes.
Basically, for all livestock, there are three systems of management. You have the intensive, you have the semi-intensive, and you have the extensive. The extensive is where you leave them in free range, they go to fend for themselves, get feeding and all of that on their own. While the semi-intensive, you supplement. You create housing for them, and the house you provide some level of feeding, and then at some point they have to go out and then get some other part of the feeding. While for the intensive, it means everything they need, you have to provide for them. That is where the intensive care comes in. And then, as a rule of thumb, while you are practicing an intensive care system, it also means this particular set of birds are not exposed to microorganisms that are in outer environment that normally, if they're in extensive system, they would have been exposed to them in little bit to the point where their body begins to generate immunity. So in this regards, where you're operating an intensive system, you need to protect them against some of these microorganisms that might cause harm or bring about diseases to them. Okay, so and where does this microorganism come? The birds don't come with the microorganism; they are being introduced to them. So the point of the biosecurity is to prevent the introduction of those microorganisms that might cause harm to them, which starts even from the point of entrance to the farm. That's the first part. The clothing you use, the other materials you like, so your pen boots, your slippers, your overall, and all of that also comes in place, as well as disinfectants. So biosecurity is an aspect of poultry that you cannot overemphasize. It's very, very important. It's key, and you must take care of that aspect. Biosecurity in simple terms meaning security, securing lives, and securing their lives in this regard talks about microorganisms. So all the ways in which microorganisms can get into the pen or to the birds to infect them, you have to block and prevent it. That is basically what biosecurity means, and I'll talk about some measures. Now, some measures meaning one of the ways which you can introduce microorganisms to your beds. Number one starts with your clothing.
Okay.
The clothing you use outside, you must have roamed about, pick some few microorganisms around. Something you cannot see with your eyes, but they are there. So the clothing you use outside and what you'll be using inside your poultry pen should be different. And that's where the idea of using overall comes in. So that even if your inner wears, you use them outside, as you at the point of entering into the pen, you have an overall that is sterile that you can use to cover. So whatever microorganism that is being harbored on your body does not escape and gets to the bed. That's one aspect of it.
So with that, before entering, if I get you correctly, before entering into the brooding room,
yes,
one would need to also sterilize.
You need to.
Okay.
You need to. That's one of the aspects where microorganisms can get to your beds. Okay. Now another means by which where microorganisms can also get to your beds is from your feet. Okay. Of course, you step on a lot of things outside, you pick different microorganisms. So when you are walking into your pen, it's expected that you don't use the same footwear you use outside, inside your brooding room. So by that implies that you should have another boot or some set of slippers within the brooding room that you change with what you've used outside. So that whatever you're making outside, you drop it outside and then you pick another one inside. And that reduces the risk of transferring microorganisms to your beds. Then another aspect that which microorganisms can get to your beds is the aspect of feeding and watering, which is one thing that a lot of farmers usually neglect. They neglect it so much. Feeding, when you're going to feed your birds, you cannot do without having contact of your hands with the feed in some instances. And your hands is one of the basic one of your basic body parts you use for basically everything. So you touch a lot of things, you can pick a lot of microorganisms without you knowing. So as a rule, it's expected that when you go into your brooding room, you should at least try to wash your hands or use gloves.
Let's now talk about vaccination. Okay. You know, vaccination is really key.
Very
so, what are the benefits of vaccinating the birds, and why do we have? Because I know it's one of the things that really costs farmers a lot. Because you spend and you have all these doctors coming, they have to charge you for every bird that they are injecting or vaccinating and so on. So, how valuable is this process, and can it be compromised in a way?
Okay.
If we have a vaccination schedule, is it possible to have some that you may feel, well, I don't need to do this? Okay. Do we have such instances?
Yeah, there are, and I'll explain. Now, the basic thing about vaccination is conferring immunity, what a layman will term as immunization. And immunization means you prepare your birds against any organism that might cause harm to them that is preventable. Of course, we all know this phrase saying prevention is better than cure. That is basically what vaccination does for you. It prevents, preventing by way of conferring immunity on them against this disease, so that when the disease comes in, their body system is prepared to attack it. That's just the cardinal point of vaccination. Now, I mentioned something earlier that when you have animals kept in extensive system and intensive system, you realize that in extensive system, you likely spend less on drugs, because even these organisms that causes some of these diseases, there is a particular range whereby if it gets to, that's when it becomes a problem. Okay? There's a particular range whereby if it doesn't get to that range, it's something the body system can actually take care of. And what you want to do in this regard, talking about vaccination, is to prepare their system by giving them little doses of these organisms that can cause diseases to them. And in this regard, most diseases, I would say 90% of the diseases we vaccinate against are viral diseases.
Okay. So if I get you correctly, what you do is to take those organisms and then ingest it into the birds,
put it certain quantity, into very little quantity, so that their white blood cells now they recognize, I've seen this virus before. Okay. You understand? In a little dose, I've seen this virus before, and I've generated antibodies that can fight. Antibodies in the form of, let me say, like soldiers. Say, for example, there's a particular group of thieves that usually comes to attack a particular area, and they come in hundreds. Okay. So now you have these soldiers that you train to identify these thieves, so that once they identify these thieves, they mobilize themselves, they call themselves up, and they increase the number, and then they attack these guys.
Interesting.
That's basically what vaccination does.
Okay.
So it's just basically with the same virus you want to prevent the birds from is what you are injecting them with, but in a little dose and in a less virulent form, so that the white blood cells now recognizes these viruses, produces antibodies, so that when the bigger dose come, they can quickly mobilize more antibodies to attack them. That's basically what vaccination does. Now, talking about the aspect of some vaccinations that some farmers might likely skip. Now, it has to do with what is called endemic diseases. There are some particular regions whereby you go to and some diseases are very, very prevalent there. There are some places where you go to and those diseases are not there. Why? Because the organisms or the condition that favors the growth of those organisms is not there. For example, I'll give you a typical example with human. If you go to a place like, let me say Russia, that is very, very cold, you don't get to hear of malaria in Russia. Why? Now, what causes...
Cold for the mosquito to survive.
So what causes malaria there is the plasmodium, which is the protozoan organism that causes the malaria. And then the vector, the carrier that carries that plasmodium is the mosquito. So if there is no mosquito, where would the malaria come from? So in such regards, now when you go to a place like Russia, which is very, very cold and is not conducive for mosquitoes to thrive, you don't get to hear of malaria there. I don't know if you get the point.
Sure.
So same thing applies to when you talk about some vaccines that you can skip. You have different regions. Say for example in Nigeria, the temperature and the weather conditions, as well as even some organisms that might be endemic in the north, you might not find them in some parts of the south. Some you find in the south, you might not find them in some parts of the north. Okay? So now there's a blanket of diseases that can affect poultry. Okay? And there are some regions where those diseases are not actually of economic importance because they don't happen there. So you can have a blanket vaccination schedule, but if that disease is not really endemic in that place, you might not really need to vaccinate. So in that regards, you can just skip. Okay. Now the danger of giving some certain vaccines where the disease is not endemic, you run the risk of importing the disease yourself. There are some diseases that are imported diseases. I'll give you an example. For example, the likes of coryza in poultry. Nigeria is in the tropics and is not part of the diseases we get to experience. But over time, due to people importing these vaccines in, gradually they might experience what is called either vaccine failure or vaccine break, where you now have these organisms being exposed to the atmosphere, and then it begins to go inoculate in some other animals and it's being transferred. Okay, so that's one aspect of what farmers actually look like, even professionals look and say, this particular disease is not endemic in this place, it's not really important to give this vaccine, so you can skip. You understand? That's the aspect of skipping vaccines. But there are some basic vaccines that are endemic to poultry everywhere in the world that you need to vaccinate again, and most of them are viral diseases. Okay, viral diseases basically. Some bacterial diseases which ordinary antibiotics can take care of, you might not need to vaccinate. Okay, except when you know that this particular disease always reoccurs in this particular geographical location. That's when you talk about, okay, you need to vaccinate. But where it's not actually a serious bacterial infection, you might not need to vaccinate the birds, because even if they come down with it, you can give antibiotics and antibiotics take care of it. And that's the difference between viral diseases and bacterial diseases. Of course, you know, for viruses, there's no treatment. You can only manage.
The region you find yourself in is also important.
Yes.
So you need to study and understand that region,
know which diseases are endemic
in those particular regions.
Then also the choice between being it a viral disease or bacterial disease is also another thing. For viral vaccines, you have to give. Because if the birds come down with it, there's no treatment. You can only manage, and of course that comes at a cost. But for bacterial diseases, you can decide not to. If you don't have the financial capacity, you can decide not to, because even if the birds come down with it, antibiotics can just take care of it.
Oh wow, interesting. A lot of farmers feel this entire brooding process is very stressful. Actually, I have done that, so I can agree with that position. The brooding process is not an easy one. It takes a lot. It is a 24-hour, like he called it, intensive care giving. Yes. So many farmers decide, well, if I can get point of lay, why not just skip the entire brooding process? I just go get point of lay.
Yes.
So is it more economical to say you get your birds a day old and brood them through, or just go straight up to get the point of lay?
Okay. Now, there are many sides to this brooding and point of lay thing. And the basic risk of going for point of lay. Now, there are risks on two sides. Okay? The risk involved in brooding is if you don't have capable hands or your management is faulty, you run the risk of going into loss. Loss meaning your birds begin to die. Okay? Which is what the farmer doesn't want. And on the same side, going for point of lay also, you also have associated risk with point of lay. Which one of the associated risks with point of lay is the challenges that comes with sharp practices. Okay? Now, the advantage of brooding over going for point of lay is this. When you are brooding your birds yourself, you know that at this particular stage, this vaccine is meant to be given. You've given this vaccine, you've given this and that vaccine. You know the entire history of your birds. So that if anything comes up later in future, you can easily tell your birds, you can give the history of the birds, and with that he can trace and know where the challenge is coming from. Okay? Why for point of lay, why I say the associated risk with point of lay is as regards the issue of sharp practices. Now some people are basically into point of lay business where they just raise these birds, they brood them and get to the point of lay, and then they sell to farmers that will keep on their beds. Now not all of these people who are into this point of lay thing are actually honest. There are some vaccines they will claim and tell you, we've given this vaccine, and at the end of the day, they will actually not giving those vaccines. So when you bring these birds to your farm as point of lay, when those issues begin to come up, you might be treating something that is not what you should be looking at. Some vaccines might have been skipped. That's one aspect. Another aspect is still regarding to sharp practices. Birds not being up to a particular age and they tell you these birds are at so age. Points of lay start from anything from 16 weeks above. Now, you might just run into a farmer that is into points of lay because he wants to make money sharply. The birds might not actually be up to 16 weeks and he tells you these birds are 15 weeks or 16 weeks.
So lack of honesty is also
sharp practices. That's just one of the basic challenge with point of lay. Then another challenge with point of lay is as regards biosecurity. Now you are taking birds from one farm, they brooded for you on one farm, they brought into point of lay, you are transporting them to your own farm where they will be laying permanently. In transit as they are moving, a lot of organisms in the air. You can inhale, pick many viruses or even bacteria along the line. So that period of transit is a window that is very, very open for a lot of infections, especially as regards to respiratory or infections that are airborne. So that period of transporting them, picking them from one farm to another exposes them it exposes them to picking some of these diseases that are airborne. You can actually pick them while transporting them. So those are the two sides to it.
There's this farmer that spoke with me about a challenge he was having with the point of lay he got. So the points of lay, after a while, the time they were expected to begin laying, it was delayed, and the production capacity was low. So could that also be a fault from the brooding process, from perhaps where he got
it from? And
so it affects production too, say egg laying.
Yes. Once there's an error along the line. You see, poultry thing is more like a garbage in, garbage out thing. Whatever you do, whatever you give in, that's what you get out. And I talked about monitoring the weight of your birds as regards to their feeding at the end of the day. There's what is called egg laying weight and egg laying body frame. Even if your birds are up to say 50 weeks, once they don't get to that, they don't attain that particular weight, there's no way you will get eggs from them. And one of the things that will not allow them to attain that weight is if their feeding is defective. And they don't meet up with that. Once the feeding is defective, they won't meet up with that weight, of course. So you run the risk of keeping your birds longer, feeding them and feeding them and feeding them. Like I said, sharp practices in point of lay business is what is discouraging a lot of farmers from taking point of lay. Now someone might have kept birds for 15 weeks. The birds might actually be up to that age, but were they properly fed? And that's why I always advise farmers that when you are going for point of lay, ensure that this point of lay you are getting them from a reputable hatchery or a reputable farm to start with. That's one. Then number two, you should also follow up and make sure you get their vaccination records And then at the same time, you also need to weigh them to be sure their weight, are they up to that egg laying weight? Or are they up to this particular weight that these birds are expected to be at this age that the farmer claims the birds to be? So those are some of the things. You can actually have birds that are 16 weeks old, you bring them to your farm, but because they were not properly fed where they were coming from, they will lag behind in terms of weight. So instead of you feeding them for some 3-4 weeks before they start laying, you realize that you have to feed them longer before they start laying, because it is when they consume feed that then they meet up with that weight before they start talking about laying. If they don't meet up with that egg laying weight, forget about eggs.
Okay. So finally, let's talk about the practices that continue even after brooding. Say, for instance, the vaccination process. Does it end the moment you are done with brooding, or are there some certain vaccinations that would still continue even after those intensive grower, all those stages? Do we have live vaccinations, or it ends at brooding?
Now, there are vaccinations that you must continue with your birds.
Okay, so it doesn't just end.
It doesn't
with
end
brooding.
Yes, it doesn't end with the brooding, because brooding is just 4 weeks. The post-brooding is another 4 weeks, is 8 weeks, and then the grower stage gets to 15-16 weeks, and then you have the pre-lay stage. Now, basically, there are major vaccines you need to give them ends at the pre-lay stage, which is the 15-16 weeks mark. That's when their major vaccines end. Okay. Now, from that point, once they begin to lay, and there's a particular disease that is, there's a word one of my bosses used, like Newcastle and Poultry, they are 5 and 6, and it's a viral disease, which means you need to renew or you boost them to further produce antibodies for them. So, and the last vaccine you are given at 15-16 weeks, part of it, the Newcastle vaccine, is also there. And if you look at your vaccination chart all through, the vaccine that reoccurs most is the Newcastle vaccine, which is one of the diseases that is attached to poultry. Okay, and is of very, very high economic importance. And I once explained to you that this disease comes in 5 forms. Okay, and it's something that you cannot separate poultry from Newcastle. So even after giving the last vaccine at their 15-16 weeks, for that particular Newcastle disease, you need to renew it, giving them booster, which is expected that the titer value for Newcastle, when you give the last shot of the vaccine at 15-16 weeks, will take you approximately 90 days before the antibody titer begins to come down, and then you need to boost them. So once you start that boosting, you have to renew it every 21 to 26 days till the point where you are disposing your birds off. You need to renew that vaccine. Now, there are 2 sides to this vaccine. What you are given before laying is the killed form of the vaccine. Okay? Once they get to laying stage now, you need to renew with the live form of the vaccine, the live virus. Okay? That's where you need to inoculate them, they generate antibodies, and they continue their life. As the disease comes, the antibodies attack the disease and go. So Newcastle vaccine is something you give all through. You give it all through, you give for life till the point where you dispose your birds.
Right. Is there any other vaccination, SOTA? Because that's something we practice here on the farm.
Yes.
I don't know if it's appropriate that it's a continuous process.
Okay. Now, the last
and then also deworming also.
Yes.
I know that's something, another practice that is done from time to time.
Yeah. Those are what we call routine practices. Deworming your birds, vaccinating your birds, those are routine practices.
So what's the time frame schedule for some of these vaccinations that we just mentioned that should? Yes.
Now, from when you give your vaccine, your 3-in-1 vaccine between 15-16 weeks, it takes about 70 to 90 days for their titer value to wane off. And then you need to boost them, and you do that within the range of 21 to 26 days. So which by implication every month you need to repeat that. That's one. Then as far as deworming and coccidiosis go, it also has to do with your system of management. Of course, if you have birds on battery cage, they don't have any contact with their litter. So the reoccurrence of worms is very, very minimal. The reoccurrence of coccidiosis is almost 0 in battery cage. But for deep litter, where your birds are kept on the floor, they have direct contact with their litter. Because you can't stop them from scouring the litter, they will pick some portion of it, which means whatever organism is there returns back to the system. So the reoccurrence of you having to deworm and treat for coccidiosis is more on the deep litter compared to battery cage. And then you have farmers telling you that on battery cage you spend less on medication, on deep litter you spend more on medication because of those recurring medications. You have to do them more. Okay, you understand? So the likes of the Newcastle vaccine, like you mentioned, Lasota. Lasota is a strain of Newcastle vaccine. There are many strains of the Newcastle. We've talked about them before. We talked about the Hitchner, we talked about the Komoro, we talked about the Lasota. Those are different strains of the vaccine. And the one that stays more with adult birds is the Lasota strain, which is why the Lasota reoccurs. So once you start your Lasota, you have to renew it every 21 to 26 days, which by implication means you have to do it every month. Now for deworming, if you have a bird on battery cage, it's expected that before anyone will develop to the point where it becomes detrimental to the bird, will take about 90 days, which is 3 months. So if your birds are on battery cage, you can redeworm them after 3 months. Okay. While if they are on deep litter, they have closer contact with their litter.
And so it should be more often.
Which will be more often, which by implication you can do like every 2 months.
Okay, 2 months.
Yeah. Not really advisable monthly. You don't want to bombard them with so many drugs. But then if the signs are showing that these birds are actually coming down once, then you can deworm as it comes up. But outside that, routinely you can do it in 2 months. Every 2 months you just repeat it. That is for Newcastle and deworming. But for coccidiosis is not a major challenge with birds on battery cage because they don't have access to their litter. Which on the deep litter, which is the floor system, they have constant access to their litter. And where this organism resides is within the litter. So it's expected that even for birds on deep litter, you can treat for coccidiosis every 2 months. Or when you see the signs clearly that these birds are coming out, what is the treat. But outside that, you can do it routinely every 2 months.
Okay. Wow. Interesting discussion today we've been having with Dr. Lukman on brooding, its importance, the value of brooding, why you need to brood, all the things you need to put in place to ensure proper brooding. Well, this is the much we can take on this discussion. And so, Dr. Lukman,
yes,
we really appreciate you for your time and discussing with us on these basics that needs to be put in place when it comes to the brooding process.
Pleasure is all mine, and I'm always open to assist farmers. Of course, that's what I do basically. And like my people they call me chief custodian of the animal kingdom.
Indeed.
So anything as regards to animal, I'm always open, willing, and ready.
Yes, he has been of immense help to us here at the farm, and really our birds have been doing well.